I'd like to welcome everyone this evening. And I'd like to thank Shantideva Center. I'd like to thank Sunny for hosting this evening and all the people at Shantideva Center that have been supporting the center and helping all the teachers and helping support this program. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back. So we are going to be discussing this profound Lojong text, and I will be talking about Lojong mind training for 3 Tuesday nights. The first 2 Tuesdays will be online, and the third one I will be in person at Shantideva Center and online. And that class will be 1/2 hour later because the center needs some time to set up the room like that. So I'm delighted to be here. And Sunny, do you have some preliminary prayers you'd like to lead? To just put our minds in the right space. And what's so important right now about engaging in a center, the text will be shown in a moment, is to set a proper motivation for being here this evening. Sorry, there we go. I keep having this thing pop up on Zoom. And it's so important to get our mind oriented in the right direction before we start any activity. So it's a wonderful thing to think about a particular teacher, to think about the Buddha, and use that as a source of inspiration as far as a direction we are moving in and the refuge we're going to support us. But the bigger purpose of everything we do in this tradition is to benefit all living beings, to benefit all living beings. And if we can reach the state of being a Buddha, being a perfect being, perfect mind, fully awakened mind, then we have the capacity to benefit and serve all living beings, emphasis on all, perfectly. So regardless of whether people help you or harm you or interfere with your agenda, you have the huge, spacious consciousness and heart to want to help all of them and to have a bit of an understanding, which is what we're going to talk about through these 3 Tuesdays, a bit of understanding to understand how they suffer and how that's so important for us to consider. And in addition, to use the suffering that we may experience from engaging with these other beings or just having unfortunate circumstances happen to us. And we use that suffering in beneficial ways to deepen our practice, to transform our minds. Okay, so can you just close your eyes for a moment? And think about your relationship with your practice. And just reflect briefly on the areas of, let's say, your whole Dharma career. For some people, maybe shorter, others longer, where we have made tremendous effort in spiritual practice. How has that made you feel? In addition to the times we don't make spiritual practice, we don't make tremendous effort. Can you reflect briefly on how does that make you feel? Can I really draw deeply from a place in my heart where I might be able to make some realistic adjustments to practice a little more deeply? And And why? So I can reach that place where I'm unlimited in benefiting all living beings. Feel that motivation as much as you can in your heart right now, in your mind. Because that is why we're here right now. If you can set that motivation. And with that intention right now, let's recite these prayers, taking refuge in generating bodhicitta. We will read it once in the English and we'll chant it twice in the phonetics. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. No sangye chodan soki chonam la janchu bardu teknikya suchi dagi jin soki pe ningi pe so namgi drola pincher sangye dru parjok sangye chodan soki chonam la janchu bardu teknikya suchi dagi jin ningi pe so namgi Drola pencher sange drup parjong. So Sunny, can we share the text? Great.
What? Wait a second. Let me see.
And I may be able to also share if you're having trouble.
Okay, thank you.
If you make me a host, then we can yeah. I'm just finally having a look at everybody that's here. It's wonderful to see all of these people. Wonderful. Oh, lovely. Great. Okay. Thank you, Sunny. Great. This is a unique Lojong text because when we speak of Lo is mind, Zhong, training or transformation. And these tend to be what I would call more intermediate level classes. So, and Sunny, if you can just deal with any comments in the chat or anything like that.
Okay.
And we also, another thing that's helpful, and sometimes the centers set the etiquette, is we want to feel at the class that we are in a gompa right now, as if we're in a gompa. So it is helpful if you put your camera on. It is helpful that you're not eating or drinking, that you're not lying down in bed and things like that. So it really is better for you as far as, participating in the class like that. That's really helpful. Thank you so much. So when we think of Lojong, Tibetan word, the Tibetan system of Buddhism is very, very focused on the mind, training the mind, transforming the mind, makes us happier. And a lot of the teaching, especially from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, is everything comes from the mind. Our whole experiences come from the mind. You've heard that again and again. And what happens on our planet, and somebody I mentioned as we were talking informally before the class started, is this weekend I was in Washington, D.C., which can be a very political city, as you know, and there's been an administrative change. And when I lived in Washington, D.C. for some years, it was very noticeable when you live there of an administrative change in the White House. So some people were discussing this at one point. Friends of mine got together, and then I was just sitting listening all the external talk and blame of how people were feeling, because Washington, D.C. is a relatively progressive city. So a number of the people that live there are very progressive in general compared to a lot of other cities. And so they were discussing in a very standard average way that most people in our world system discuss. And some of it was negative and much blaming. And then suddenly one person spoke up who had been extremely involved in politics and used to work for the State Department, and then said to me, "So what's the Buddhist view? How do you feel? Like, what's your response to this? And, what are you doing in the world?" And and then I realized it's so challenging to explain to most of the world that everything comes from your mind. So I started to put it into a broader context, explaining to them. But for me, it becomes simpler because the projection is there of what my world's showing me, right? But for me to blame, and you have to check yourself, it makes me not peaceful if I'm blaming externally. My mind becomes unbalanced. And if I own and acknowledge and take responsibility, this is just coming from my mind, meaning past activities that I've done with my body, speech, and mind. Okay. And if they're positive, I get a positive result. And if those past activities are negative, I get a negative result. Right? But that's where it's coming from. And this is through an exploration of myself, of where does my suffering come from? How can I change anything? Do I have power to do that? Right. So we have a lot of control in Buddhism, because you can fix your mind. I can't fix the externals. But when I do fix my mind, I do find even my own little small microcosm of world system can shift in a way, and that I can still keep my mind relatively balanced, right? And do my practice and help beings. So for me, my biggest view is I don't want anything to disturb, as little as possible to disturb my trying to help as many beings as possible. That's my motivation every morning. I want to try to help as many beings as possible. So what I found in the weekend discussion with very, very good people, it's not that there's anything wrong with them, but a lot of it is, how is this affecting my world, my life? It's a smaller focus of me and my family and my life. And that's important. Like, you have to take care of your life and your family. But if you don't have the bigger extension of how can I help others as well, right? For me, it becomes more self-absorbed, and I'm not happy. I'm not happy because I'm relying on that external to bring me the happiness. So if suddenly that external changes and looks different, then I'm not happy, right? But not realizing it's coming from my mind, and let me turn up my practice. Let me do more purification. Let me do more practices that enhance all the positive attributes of my life, and things like that you can do. So we hear of Lojong, and Lojong goes to the heart of this. We hear of Lojong texts, the famous one being the 8 verses of mind training. The 8 verses of mind training. And Geshe Langri Tangpa, the great Kadampa master, brought us those texts. And we also have 7 verses of mind transformation, Geshe Chikawa. Okay, and they're related because one inspired the other. Okay, and then we also come into the slogans from Master Atisha, mind training slogans. So this is all a huge compartment, but what we don't often go to is this text. Okay, so let's go back to the text. Thank you, Sunny. Great. And so this is from Jikme Tenpe Nyima, the third drum, Dupchen Rinpoche, turning suffering and happiness into enlightenment. And that's what we really want to do. This is our path. And it can be as simple as this, turning suffering and happiness into enlightenment. I just want to read the beginning. And because what these texts often do, there's always a homage in the beginning of these texts. So what they're doing is paying homage to some aspect of the enlightened consciousness, in this case, the Buddha of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. Sometimes it could be Manjushri, the Buddha of infinite wisdom. Could be another Buddha, like Tara. So here's the first step for you. And I'm going to break it down into some really easy steps because we only have 3 sessions. It's not really enough to really discuss the text thoroughly, but we can do the text again in a longer version. We can do it over a weekend. I am going to be teaching this again in Europe this summer, and that is hybrid. So if you want to listen to longer versions of it or other versions, you can also jump in and get a little bit more like that. It'll be online. And so the first thing is, what about thinking about your day and how you wake up? And any activity you do you think about your teacher? And some of you may not have a particular teacher, that's okay. But do you think about a Buddha? Do you think about enlightened consciousness as you're going about your business? And I'm just going to give you a practical example, okay? So I just got back from about 9 months away, and I'm back at what I would consider home, and I'm very happy to be home because it's just been a whirlwind, and it was a most fantastic year, but I'm truly tired, and it was just a lot of different things, and there's nothing quite like being home, right? And you're on your own schedule, and you know where things are, and you don't have somebody kind of knocking on the door and things like that. So I got home about a couple of weeks ago. I think it's just been a couple of weeks, and there's a vast list of things I have to get done because I'm only here for 2 months, and then I leave again for some months. So there's things that are easier for me to do in the States on an administrative level, on a healthcare level, on teaching level, on my schedule. I mean, it just goes on and on. And I was a little overwhelmed getting back with this list of the things I have to do. And I've just been working through the list. And so today, a lot of errands and a lot of things. And then some days it goes well, right? Some days things are falling into place, and they were. And so at the end of something that kind of came together really auspiciously, and I kind of was like, huh, that really worked out. Like I didn't expect that to work out, but it really did. I had this little moment. I was like, thank you, Rinpoche. Thanks for helping me with that. So I often feel my teacher, I keep him in my heart all the time, even though actually Lama Zopa Rinpoche, my main teacher, passed away a year and a half ago. I feel him with me all the time. And there's other teachers, or the Buddha. You can think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and just have a presence of them in your mind. So right away in this text, we have homage to Arya Avalokiteshvara. Okay? So think about that as adding in something a little loftier than yourself. And some days you need help. Some days it's not going well. So can I call on that energy, whether it's Tara, or, I've certainly been in some of the travel modes I've been in and really been like, okay, Tara, we've got a long flight and I've got to change, and the luggage, and, my bag's a little bit overweight. So, and then just bring in that presence in, and somehow, 9 times out of 10, honestly, it's gone more smoothly. So, so that could be helpful. So I just want to read this beginning. Homage to Arya Avalokiteshvara by the recollection of his qualities, which were celebrated thus. He who will ever be made happy by the happiness of others, and who feels extreme distress when suffering comes to them, having fully attained the quality of great compassion, he will renounce his own happiness and sufferings. And then this Rinpoche goes on to say, I'm going to write a partial instruction on acceptance of happiness and suffering as the path. It is the most precious teaching in the world and a necessary tool for the holy life. And I would add and just say a necessary tool for life in general. whether you feel you're leading a particularly holy life or not. These are tools that are essential, I would say. So can we go down a little bit on the page? Thank you so much. Okay, it starts with relative truth, the way of accepting suffering as a path to enlightenment. So it goes right into the suffering in the beginning. And what happens for most of us, and this is where most of us are, and I like that it starts with suffering, transforming suffering, because we're always interested and we want to be happy. And we are averted from suffering, very much so. So we push suffering away. We don't want it. We don't know how to deal with it. We don't want to be anywhere near it. But the true practitioner, and again, this is more intermediate, advanced stage teachings, the really deeper practitioners, and one of my friends said to me some years ago, when you meet your Dharma friends, and so this April, there's a big meeting in Nepal at Kopan Monastery, an organizational meeting, and some of you may be attending that meeting, okay? And you meet, I think it will be a large meeting, and you will meet some old friends that you may have Dharma friends from around the world. And so occasionally you start talking and sharing things, and oh, I did that retreat, and I did this Nundro, and where were you recently? And so people will start discussing with each other what they've been doing. And I had a friend in one of these conversations I had some years ago who said, he said, honestly, to me, and he said, and he's not a boaster, not someone who would boast, but he said, I'm getting to the point where I'm inviting suffering. Like, because what we used to do is when suffering would come, we just worked to transform it, but we still didn't want it there. But he said he's now at the point where he wants the suffering to come. So how do we get there? And why would we want that? Why would we want that? Okay, because it transforms you, because our minds, and look at the lives we've had. So I don't know all of your stories, but look at our lives compared with many, many other beings around the planet. So I'm just going to name a few places right now, and many of you are aware of this, but I just had a conversation with somebody recently. Sudan, I'm just going to name the country of Sudan, okay? If you're familiar at all with the political situation going on there, people are familiar with what's happening in Gaza, the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia, like that. But Sudan is often buried a little bit in the news, right? I think African news gets a little less attention sometimes, like that. The world of color, in a sense, okay? But there's been war going on there for ages. People are starving, like that, of all ages. And one of the things I read of in the past year about the tactics of the war, what they're doing is there are farmers there. And because I spent the summer at Laudo on retreat, which is in Nepal, Laudo is kind of a small farm where the people are very poor in that region, and they live very far from any kind of markets. So as a result, they need to grow their own food, and it's a big, urgent task that they spend a lot of their time on, growing, harvesting, taking care of their own food. And that's a way they support themselves and eat. And they have beautiful food up there, but it's hard work. And I've watched over the years as it's gotten a little streamlined with greenhouses. And this is the first year I heard in the valley below, when they were doing the harvest of potatoes, I heard a harvesting machine going on. Somebody had some sort of something that did with a motor I could hear, which I've never heard. It's all been done by hand, people digging in the ground like this. So somebody had some kind of mechanism. So they grow their own food. So what they're doing in Sudan is when you go out to tend your food, either you're weeding, you're thinning crops, you're replanting crops to get another crop out of it, which they were doing in Nepal this year, and I was helping at one point. You're harvesting like that, and then you're a lot of it is mixed with animal manure and things like that. This was the same system in Nepal, and it's the same system everywhere in places where poor people grow food and where people grow food in general. So what they're doing is when you go out to tend your food, they're shooting you. So they're starving people to death. That was one of their war tactics in Sudan. It's just tragic. It's just horrible. So it's not even just directly attacking people and things. It's just not letting them grow their food, and it goes on from there. It's just horrible. Some of you've read about it. So if you look at your life in relation to those people, in relation to Gazans, in relation to Ukrainians, in relation to, like, there's so many people in the world. You could just look in the United States, because I was surprised a little bit, and I've seen this in California, because California has a milder climate. As a result, there's many people that live on the street in California, and I think in Los Angeles there's about 70,000 unhoused people. So you see tent cities in these areas, but I saw them in Washington, D.C., people living in tents. And the other day in downtown Philadelphia, there was, I really didn't know what to do. There was a man, you know how cold it's been in the Northeast, how freezing cold this winter's been. There was a man lying on a grate on the sidewalk, like ice cold sidewalk, lying down, sleeping with a blanket over him because the grate had steam coming up. And it must have been a high of, like, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're not living like that. I just find it tragic in these cold climates, and the fact that our rich country can't provide some sort of housing for everyone. So again, when you think we're not living like that. We have food, clothing, and shelter. We're so fortunate, okay? Incredibly fortunate. So we need to do some suffering to purify us, to move us along the path. Unless you're a perfectly pure being, then you don't need to suffer. But for some of us, we know we've messed up in this life. We know we've used our speech non-virtuously. We know we've had non-virtuous thoughts. Right? We've done some non-virtuous actions, and that's only this life what we can remember. So what about past lives we don't remember? So anytime you have suffering rear its head to you in the life you have now, it's a form of purification, right? And we need that. We really need that to happen, to clean up like that. So rather than shying away from it and turning in on yourself and getting depressed, kind of have your eyes open and say, okay, I've created this. Sometimes you might need to buckle your seatbelt a little more intensely to get through it. That's okay. But just think about, this is a great way for me to clean up right now. This is a great way for me to clean up. So what happens is the suffering will come. Sometimes it comes unconsciously, or it comes unexpectedly. It comes in a form we did not want it. Or we can also choose deeper purification practices to have that suffering averted before it ripens, before it comes to us as suffering, as something we label suffering. I'll give you an example. I was fortunate enough, as I was coming on my way home from India and Nepal, and decided I had a month suddenly, I could do some Nungne practices, which are intense fasting practices using a practice of the Buddha of compassion. You're fasting, you're doing a lot of prostrations, it's rigorous. And I was able to get another month done of these basically 2-day retreats in a group setting, which is a deep way to purify. So it's suffering as you're doing it, like you are experiencing some suffering. Maybe you're hungry, maybe you're really thirsty, maybe you're very hot or cold during the retreats, or sleepy. But that was a way that I could better control and choose. I want to do it in a retreat mode that I think I hopefully purified something that may minimize some suffering for me in the future. But suffering comes. It always comes to us. Okay. So first, they're looking in this text at relative truth, just where we identify suffering as suffering. We identify suffering as suffering. So can we go down a little further to the little at letter I there, Sunny? Yeah. Reject the state of mind. So here's the beginning. Can you reject the state of mind exclusively desiring not to have suffering? Okay, and first I'll read, if you do not know that the responsibility lies within one's own mind's way of experiencing, okay, and you put the blame on external objects alone, okay, then he goes on to say the ceaseless flame of suffering and anger, bad karma, increases. Okay, so this is called experiences arising in the form of the enemy. So that's what usually happens, is if you're not owning the suffering that's coming from your own mind, And it's kind of like, why is this happening? And you start blaming out, you're creating more negative karma for yourself. And he goes on to say, and it's nice if we'll, hopefully in the three things we'll read the text. He goes on to say, you should thoroughly understand that the reason why sentient being, when actually, Sunny, let's go back up and I'll make sure we read the whole text before, if we get, okay, by means of the relative truth, whenever harm comes to you from beings or non-beings, if your mind experiences on the consciousness of sorrow, then even from a small incident, great mental pain will develop. For it is its nature that any consciousness, either of suffering or happiness, will increase by experiencing it. If the experiencing gradually becomes stronger, a time will come when most of what appears will become the cause of drawing unhappiness to ourselves, and happiness will never have a chance. And then he goes on to say again about, if you don't know that the responsibility lies within your own mind, you're going to increase negative karma for yourself. Okay. The next paragraph, you should thoroughly understand that the reason why sentient beings of the dark age, and I'll say degenerate age, are afflicted by suffering is fundamentally related to the weakness of their discriminating awareness. Okay, so people are challenged. A lot of people I know are challenged right now in the world, period. Okay, and it says the weakness of their discriminating awareness. You know, there's a lot of people on the planet right now, when I hear discussions, even political discussions, that are just saying, a lot of times people choose a leader, and a lot of times they're following a certain course of being because they do not know. You know, it could be a blatant level of uneducation or undereducation. But here's the next thing about not knowing is we don't have an understanding of emptiness. And as a result of that, we're constantly choosing mistakes. We're constantly engaging in a mistaken reality and believing in it, building it up, and relying on it and expecting it to bring us happiness. So there's kind of this weakness of discriminating awareness. Okay? So then, therefore, not to be hurt by the obstacles of enemies, illness, and harmful spirits does not mean that we can drive away vicissitudes such as illness and that they will not occur again. Rather, it means that they will not be able to arise and take the form of obstacles to the practice of the path to enlightenment. Okay? So if you're doing this practice, what he's saying is, and you're trying to really be a good Dharma practitioner, it doesn't mean that obstacles won't arise. The issue is, how do you deal with the obstacles? Do you see it as a blessing? Do you learn to welcome it and realize, oh, because I've got, let's say, the Dharma, in a sense, as you engage in Dharma, it's like you found this jewel, you know, and our minds are like this jewel, okay? But when you first engage in Dharma, the jewel is a bit rough, it's not polished. So it's like finding a diamond in a mine, and it's covered in all this carbon and all this other stuff. And then our practice is we slowly start cleaning. We slowly start cleaning it. And little bits are revealed, and every once in a while, a little something will shine through. Okay? But our practice is the constant transforming that very gross jewel and very coarse jewel into something really beautiful like that. So it doesn't mean there's not going to be obstacles and that suddenly you meet the Dharma and everything's going to be fine again. It doesn't work like that. You have to spend effort to purify all the different lifetimes you've had like that, where you had a misknowing in your mind. You didn't understand emptiness. You didn't generate the good heart, things like that. Okay. So then he says here, going on, if you'd like this to come about, where the Dharma path is accelerating in a sense, reject the state of mind, okay, that desires not to have suffering. So this is really hard because nobody wants suffering. Okay, so he's saying, ascertain again and again the uselessness, the harmfulness of considering suffering as something unfavorable. What if you could get your mind there? Okay, because what's going to happen is, in samsara, that's its nature. And what happens is people turn away from samsara. Most of the planet doesn't even know the word samsara. Samsara, again, is a Sanskrit term that means simply to turn or to cycle. And what we're cycling through is birth, old age, sickness, and death. And all of that is suffering. Okay? So what we try to do is we're in this constant denial of samsara, constant denial. Everything's going to be okay. As soon as I get my new job, everything's going to be great. As soon as my kid gets settled in their apartment, in their school, and they're getting married, everything's going to be great. As soon as this person moves out, everything's going to be good. As soon as my boss leaves, everything will be fine. As soon as we take care of that medical condition, everything's going to be fine. It's not possible in samsara. There would just be another thing. Okay? So what if you could get your mind to the point, this is huge, where I'm not kind of dealing with suffering as something that I don't want in my realm. I'm just, the bigger place is I look at the suffering and go, okay, I'm ready. This is its nature and I'm ready. And it says, and be aware, okay, of how much anxiety is caused for you because all you're trying to do is see suffering as something unfavorable. How much anxiety that causes in your life, where if you see it and you're, in a sense, as my friend said, welcoming it, much less anxiety. Now, this is not about masochism. I'm signing up for suffering. I want suffering. I'm going to cut myself. I'm going to sabotage myself. No. This is you leading the best life you can lead with the biggest heart, most open mind, okay? Suffering, I hate to say it, most probably suffering is going to rear its head. How do you want to face it? How do you want to deal with that? Okay. So again, here it is. Train yourself to develop great courage. Okay. And experience powerfully the thought that from now on, whenever suffering comes, I'm not going to be anxious. Can you try that one? Whenever suffering comes, I will not be anxious. Okay. And here's ways that he goes through of, well, how do I deal with this? Okay. We've got A, B, C, D. We've got a whole lot of letters coming up. Okay. A, the uselessness of considering suffering as unfavorable. So think about it. If you can cure the suffering, why be unhappy? And this is that old saying of like, if there's something I can change, His Holiness says this a lot, then you act to change it. But if I can't change it, because samsara's nature is suffering, why am I going to be unhappy about it? There's something maybe strange. Maybe I'm being really ignorant now. I don't know. But when this person asked me recently, this past weekend, about what's the Buddhist response to the current political situation in the States and the leader and things like that, and some of the statements in the news that seem sort of outrageous, and I used to be very involved in politics, so I had very strong opinions, and now I really limit how much news I'm taking in. And so if you want to watch a lot of news and you feel like you have strong opinions about it, or you're finding that the news, there's several people I've talked to recently, a couple of them long-term Buddhists, and they call me and they're railing about the news and what he's doing, and he's doing this and she's doing that. And I'm like, why are you spending time watching that? You can quickly look at a news story. I like to just know what's going on quickly. And if I don't like a story, that I'm reading something and I don't like where it's going and I find it's upsetting my mind a little bit, I just turn it off. Why not? Right? I turn it off because there's a lot of other things you can study in Dharma that are going to make your mind much happier. Okay, so you have to think about it. So again, if there's something I can do and I can change something, figure out, again, I've said this many times before, with compassionate wisdom, how can I take action? How can I think? What would I like to say in this context? Nothing, and I've assessed that, and there's nothing I can do. I really don't need it to bother my day, and especially if you're clear on your motivation for the day. My motivation for the day is I want to show up for the best of my practice I can do, okay, in a truly compassionate, wise way, as much as possible, to reach a place where I can benefit all living beings fully, perfectly. If you keep that motivation in mind, then I'm going to use whatever suffering turns up. Okay. So this beginning of seeing, like lessening the idea that suffering is something unfavorable. Okay. And then he goes on, the great harm of considering suffering as something unfavorable. That's the way we view suffering. So that's why this is really radical, Lojong. Lojong is, it's total mind transformation. I mean, we're normally like, suffering is bad. Suffering is unfavorable. So he says, if you do not feel anxious, when suffering shows up, your strength of mind can help you bear even the greatest of sufferings easily. Okay? The greatest of sufferings will come to you. They feel light and flimsy like cotton. Because of anxiety, you're ceaselessly oppressed by unhappy feelings, and even small sufferings are intolerable. Okay? So then he goes on to give examples. If you're thinking of a beautiful man or woman, even if you try to get rid of desire, you exhaust yourself. So by concentrating, likewise, by concentrating on the painful characteristics of suffering, you can't necessarily develop patience. If I'm just totally immersed in this is awful, I don't want this is awful, it's hard to really use my mind with that, again, strength of mind, he said, to figure out how to develop patience, to have the courage to develop patience in the face of adversity. Okay? So as in the case of instructions on sealing the doors of the faculties, you should not concentrate your mind on the characteristics of suffering, but you should become experiences in keeping your mind in its normal conditions and in its own state. So what he's saying is, we close, when he says sealing the doors of the faculties, what he's talking about your sense faculties. So if you have tremendous desire, you may decide to move away from that person that you're really lusting after, or the chocolate that you're lusting after, or something like that, right? Or it could be an item of clothing or whatever it is, like that. And so what we would do is sometimes you just need to be away from the object, like that. And so it's the same of, rather than concentrating my mind on these characteristics of suffering, can my mind stay balanced, open, focused on its own nature itself, which is clear and aware? That's my mind. Why do I need it to get toppled by all these things coming in through my sense faculties? So some really great things you can work with, especially this week. Think about that. Think about, where is suffering showing itself from this week to the next week? This particular week, look at, where am I averted from it that it's creating a lot of anxiety for me, like that? And what can I do to keep my mind balanced so I can realize this is coming from my mind? What can I do about it? If there's nothing I can do about it, can I let it go and go on to some way I can deepen my practice with that motivation to benefit all living beings, to become a Buddha, to benefit all living beings? So here's another one of, can you develop an attitude of being happy that sufferings arise? Okay, this was my friend of, I'm now welcoming, like I'm happy when it comes. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was like that. That's not the normal thing again. This is radical. This is a radical approach to your Dharma practice. I mean, and this is a story I told before. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, years ago, was with his main attendant, Venerable Roger, Australian monk. Some of you have met him. And they were traveling through Singapore, and they were brought to, I think, the home they were supposed to stay in, or they were meeting with some students. And the people were very, very wealthy, and they had this huge house that was like a museum. And so somebody greeted them at the door and brought them into this very big living room. And while they were waiting there, just the two of them, just Rinpoche and Roger, and they were waiting a little bit, and then Rinpoche turned to Roger, and the house was in a perfectly beautiful garden, safe place. Singapore's a relatively safe place anyway, as a country, and they were in the waiting, and the house was very safe, but there was no one else in the room. And then Rinpoche turned to Roger and said, very seriously, we're in great danger here. We're in great danger. And Roger, looked at Rinpoche, and Rinpoche was very serious, and Roger looked around and thought, like, what's wrong? And Rinpoche said it again. And then Roger looked at him, and then Rinpoche said, we're using up so much merit. Like by being taken care of by these people in this incredibly comfortable situation, you burn through merit, you burn through positive energy, and you need a balance of, you need a lot of merit to get enlightened, and you also need to clear away all the negativities in your mind. That's what Buddha means, Sangye in Tibetan, Sangye, Rinpoche's brother's name. His brother passed away a few months ago, very unfortunately. Sangye Sherpa was his name. So Sangye, Sang is elimination of all the negative qualities. Gye, complete adherence to all the positive qualities, fully developed positive qualities. So an elimination of all the negative, completely gone all the negative karma in your mind, and all the positive qualities enhanced, you automatically become a Buddha. You are Buddha at that point. You are Buddha. Sangye. Okay? So that's where sometimes when I am in a very nice situation, I'm thinking of, well, if the suffering was there, I sometimes feel like I'm doing a little bit better Dharma practice. Do you ever feel that way? And there's going to be some suffering coming when things are going too well. So somehow for me, even in the Nungnes, which was a great way to do it because I chose to do this month-long retreat, to do a month of them. And every other day you didn't eat, speak, or drink. And by the end of that day, I felt really weak and kind of cold and tired and very, very hungry. For some reason, this month in Nungnes, I'm not usually hungry during Nungnes. This one I was really hungry. So they all manifest in different ways. But somehow when I go to bed at night, I felt really happy. My mind was really happy like that. And then I had a kind of easier time after that. And I was thinking, I don't think I'm practicing as hard right now. So think about that, of when sufferings arise, can you actually welcome, have an attitude that is this is a way. So practicing cultivating joy because you're considering suffering, as the Rinpoche says here, as an aid to the path, You're cleaning away, you're clearing the path for you. So whenever suffering arises, he says, you must have a virtuous practice to apply to it according to the ability of your mind, okay? Because it will be difficult to succeed if you only ponder the general principle that a spiritual method can bring certain benefits from suffering as a support to practice. So as it said, that is farther than the earth from the sky. So basically what he's saying is, make sure you have some valid practices to reach for when the suffering shows up, so that I'm going to further deepen. So the suffering comes and then I go, okay, here I am. Like there I'd be in the Nungnes, hungry, cold, tired at the end of the day. And I'd be like, okay, like I know I've done these Nungnes before. What do I need to do? So you can take care of yourself in that, but have some practice thing to orient where this is the practice. Like I'm going to recite Tara mantras, or I'm going to do a meditation on the Buddha of practice, or I'm going to read that Dharma book that I said I would read. And I know that many, many times when I've been on retreat at Laudo, especially the first few times I was there alone, it was very, very hard for my mind. And I would get very depressed at times. And the first time you're kind of alone in your practice for a few months. And I had this book on emptiness I was reading. And all I had to do was turn to like a chapter and read a little bit. Or I had the poems of that Milarepa wrote, his beautiful songs. And I'd open to one and read it and then go right into the Dharma practice. And then it would change. It would definitely change. So make sure you figure out what is going to work for your mind as Dharma practice, that's what you reach for, rather than, raiding the refrigerator and eating all the ice cream. It doesn't make you feel good. Or binge watching shows or something else that doesn't really benefit like that. Does that make sense? Am I communicating? Everybody okay? I will make time for some questions in a little bit. So here's some ways that he's talking about. These are some of the things you can reach for, that you can think about, okay? So look at A, suffering as a support, a training in the thought of turning away from samsara. Renunciation. when suffering shows up, can it deepen my renunciation? So that's a great one to use in the beginning. So he's just giving you some really practical things. So you think, as long as you're wandering powerless in samsara, which is all of us, all ordinary beings, suffering does not arise as something unfair, unjust, he says, okay? But that the nature of samsara is just that, is suffering. So reflect that if it's difficult to bear even little sufferings of the wonderful rebirth we have, what he's calling the happy realms, okay? There's nothing to be said about the lower realms. Imagine coming back in a lower realm. So you can also develop some sadness thinking, alas, samsara is an endless and unfathomable ocean of suffering, okay? You could also reflect on others' suffering in lower realms, but just reflecting on the nature of samsara, when the suffering turns up, this is samsara's nature, or this always happens to me. This is, just see it as the nature of samsara to build conviction that you can reach liberation. Liberation is a permanent cessation of all your mental afflictions. Nirvana, it's nirvana. So it's not enlightenment, but you're on your way to enlightenment with that. So could you use it when the suffering turns up and say, let me deepen my wish to get out of samsara, my wish to get out of samsara. Very powerful way to use it, to use the suffering. So that's one of the Dharma things you can reach for to support your practice. Let's look at B. Suffering as a support of training and taking refuge. How many people do this? Okay, practice taking refuge by gaining certainty that the three jewels are the only unbetraying refuge amidst the continual suffering of fear and danger throughout the succession of your lives, so that you depend on them in all ways, not renouncing them under any circumstances. So again, how's your refuge? I just say in general, how is your refuge? Most people I know, Dharma practitioners, are not really thinking about it every day. So that's why often people get up and at least have those, what the refuge that we mentioned in the beginning, the refuge prayer we did, the very basic is people recite that 3 times in the morning, 3 times in the evening. But some of you have been practicing longer, okay? So how many of you, think about it, have you done a refuge nundro? Meaning you're counting certain mantras with a certain visualization, right? That deepens your refuge, a visualization of the Buddha, visualization of your teacher, like that. And certain visual that is incredible for deepening your refuge, so that it becomes where something good happens to you during the day, and you think of, and you thank the Buddha, you thank your teacher, you feel them with you moving through. And when suffering comes up, that's who you reach for. That's who you think of first. You know, not why did this person do that to me? Why were they rude? Why did they say that to me? Why was this person horrible in the subway? Why did this person drive and, you know, almost run me off the road? And this person's rude in this shop, and this person wouldn't help me. And it's not like that. It's kind of like, this is samsara's nature. Okay. Can I deepen my refuge? Meaning the support I go to when I don't want to suffer anymore. And that's Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. That's the 3 jewels of refuge. Okay. That's what we want to reach for. But the other thing that's helpful in using refuge as a support for your Dharma practice, to support your mind when you're suffering and your life when you're suffering, is in taking refuge, you might need to learn more about the qualities of Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. You may need to understand more about the qualities of them. The Dharma being the real refuge. Dharma meaning ultimate Dharma, the teachings on emptiness. The teachings on emptiness. Okay? So it's critical that you really start to deepen the Dharma, especially some of you. So think about a refuge nundro. You know, we have a booklet from FPMT, explains exactly how to do that practice. And it's very, very powerful, especially as an early nundro. Nundro is different than nungne. Nundro, I'm not pronouncing it that well. Nundro, it's in the back of the throat, are preliminary practices preliminary practices help you sweep away negative karma that you've created in this life, in past lives, and help you accumulate the positive conditions you need to get enlightened. And they're very powerful, and I totally believe they work, having done many, many Nundro myself. So the refuge is a relatively easy one. It's a relatively easy visualization. It's something you can do when you're working full time. I did it when I was running a center working full time. I did a session in the morning, session in the evening, as much as I could. Sometimes I could only do one session. You have to do at least one session a day. You recite a number, certain mantras, very powerful. Okay. Let's go on to C. Suffering as a support of training and dispelling arrogance. Okay. So again, if you want to work through some of the root delusions, pride is one of them. Pride is one of them. Annihilate pride and contempt for others, which are destructive enemies of merits. By becoming aware that one has no freedom, one has not passed beyond the control of suffering. I'm not any better than anyone else, because ordinary living beings that are called sentient beings, beings with a consciousness, but it's a tainted, contaminated consciousness, meaning you haven't had a direct perception of emptiness yet, because then you change into what's called an Arya being, a noble being. And that is distinct by your having had a direct perception of emptiness. Okay? So as an ordinary sentient being, you experience certain delusions. Okay? And some people think they're better than others, but ordinary sentient beings, we all suffer. I'm no better than anyone else because I suffer just like everyone else. Just like everyone else. So use it to dispel the arrogance. Use it as a force against the arrogance, instead of against other beings, and instead of against the suffering, that I don't want the suffering. Think, okay, this can really humble me. And I know that in some of my times in life when I've really suffered more than other times, let's say, it's incredibly humbling. It's incredibly humbling. And it's been incredibly powerful for me to experience that. Very, very beneficial, I would say, like that. So let's look at D as another Dharma practice. Suffering as a support for purification of negative karma. I mentioned this a little bit already. The suffering that you experience, and sufferings that are unimaginably numerous, okay, and they all arise, and numerous and severe, all arise from defilements alone. So whatever negative thing I've thought, said, done in the past with my body, speech, or mind, okay, that's where it comes from, all that negativity. So think carefully about these four principles: the certainty of karma, the tendency, and these are the four characteristics of karma. Okay, so I've got karma's definite. If I think, say, do something negative, definitely ripens in suffering for me. If I do think, say something positive, it will definitely ripen in something, in happiness for me. Okay. Second characteristic of karma, it increases. Tendency of karma to increase greatly. So I do small negativity without any purification, and it can grow and grow and grow into something greater, more suffering, bigger suffering. Okay. And another one, and also positive things, if they're encouraged and watered and fertilized, positive activities. Okay. And meaning I didn't get angry and I dedicated properly, they can increase and grow as well. Second characteristic of karma. The third one, you won't encounter the result of something you didn't create the cause for. Here it says you will not encounter the result of what you have not done. So you don't experience somebody else's karma. You can't blame them because, you were in a car accident with them. You have your own mind, your own seeds in your own consciousness. And the fourth characteristic is over time, here it says what you have done will not be wasted. So over time, if there's a karmic imprint there, it will come to fruition, it will ripen. When the right conditions come together, it will ripen. Now, if there's negative karma, that's about to ripen. Okay, you can purify it before it ripens through purification practices. So here's the title of D is suffering as a support for purification of negative karma, like that. So I can see that as the suffering comes, this is the way I'm welcoming it. This is the way I'm happy when it comes. And there's an old story ancient story of a meditator that, and I actually think I heard this from somebody that was Geshe Wangdu, I want to say, who was a dear friend, I may have the name wrong, a dear friend of Lama Yeshe. They were both at one point living at Tushita, our meditation center in Dharamsala, where His Holiness lives. I had the good fortune of teaching there for a month again in November. I taught a couple courses. I hadn't been there in many years. And His Holiness lives there. And if you do go to Dharamsala, His Holiness is now conducting frequent public audiences. So could be 200 people at a time, but it's like a walk by. But His Holiness is there. I got to see His Holiness in November up close and personal and talk to him for a moment and got an incredible blessing and unbelievable. So the Geshe Wangdu, I thought, lived up in, I remember, I think I saw his meditation hut years ago. I think they've knocked it down now, but it was near Tushita. And I think he came back once and someone had broken in and stole his meditation cloak. So often the meditators in that area, it's very, very cold there in the winter. In the old days, nothing was heated unless you had like a little fire in your hut. And you had these big meditation cloaks. They have them at Laudo. They're called dagam meditation cloaks. They're incredibly warm. I always have one on my retreat at Laudo, and all I have to do is put that thing around me. It's wool, partially wool, I think, and keeps you very, very warm. So, because monastics are not supposed to wear sleeves generally, so that was a way to keep warm. Somebody stole his meditation cloak, and they were telling me the story that he was so happy. So this is a way to transform it, the suffering. We would see it as suffering, but he was so happy, and he said, "Oh, maybe somebody needs it more than I do." So, and that was the way and then he made an offering in his mind because he didn't want them to have the karma of stealing. So in his mind, he just offered it to them and said, "Oh, good, I'm so glad somebody really needed it more than I did." So there's a way of changing your mind, right? There's an attitude. Really incredible. So you can use this to purify. Think about it as a purification of negative karma. And I think he actually added that, "Oh, good, I've just cleaned something out, just cleaned something away." So here it goes on to say, reflect that if you do not want suffering, then you should renounce the cause of suffering, which is being non-virtuous. Purify the previously accumulated defilements by the four powers and endeavor to prevent future defilements from arising. So here they're talking about purify by the four powers is the four opponent powers that we do with very good purification practice like Vajrasattva. So you'd have a power of regret, where you'd first regret whatever negativity you have that you can remember that you've done. You can have a specific regret for something you've done recently. The second power is taking refuge in perhaps an image of the Buddha that can help you purify, like Vajrasattva. The third power is the power of the remedy, where you're going to visualize a certain light coming through you, or Vajrasattva, something like that, coming over the top of your crown, and light, radiant, purifying nectar coming down through you, and while you're reciting some mantras. And then the fourth opponent power is resolution, where you're resolving and committing, dedicating in your mind and heart to refrain from a certain negative behavior again, but really making something realistic that you'll refrain from to really create a new positive habit, like that. And then E, suffering as a support for attraction to virtue. Suffering as a support. So reflect that if you desire happiness, the opposite of suffering, okay, you need to practice its cause, which is virtue. So consider thoroughly and at length how to act for the increase of virtue. So in the beginning, I asked, just to reflect briefly, is times that you have ardently, kind of eagerly practiced Dharma. And think about different times, you were really into reading those Dharma books. You were joining a Dharma book club. You were going to the center near you regularly. You were engaging in some online courses regularly, doing all the homeworks and the exams and finishing the Discovering Buddhism modules that you wanted to do, or some of the other courses that we've had. More and more, helping a center. Sometimes people volunteer, whether it's a center or something else, they're doing regular volunteer work. Helping other beings. Like, there's so many ways we practice virtue. So many ways we practice virtue. So when you're doing those things, and maybe you're really actively countering some delusions in your mind, like you're very aware of what your major delusions are, and you're working on what are the antidotes to each of those specific delusions, and you're building that into your daily life every day. It's very significant, okay? So it's helpful to look at when you're in those modes, and how do you feel in those modes? And versus when you're doing less Dharma practice, and you get kind of lost in everyday life, and lost in kind of, this weekend it was lovely. It was wonderful to see some friends. They're not Buddhist per se. It was like kind of my life before I lived in Washington, D.C., just before I met the Dharma. But they're very open, they're very supportive of what I do, it's no problem. But when I'm around them a lot, like all that they talk about and stuff, I find I start getting absorbed into that world. Now I'm back in Philadelphia. So my family right now, and I'm not living with my family, I'm living alone, but my family is right now in this area very consumed with a certain football game that's going to happen this Sunday, because the Philadelphia team is going to be in this game, and it's the final game. And that's all people talk about here. That when you go out to the stores, everybody has a green shirt on of this team. Everybody but me, right? It's so funny. And so I find myself, like, first of all, I don't like football. I find it very violent, but I'm not interested in having any paraphernalia of that team. And I've never really followed it before, but I find myself, because I'm living here, my family's, I find myself kind of pulled into these things going, oh, well, what time is the game? I'll probably be with my family on that day because it's a fun family out, thing with them, to hang out with them like that. So you just find that, so again, there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong. How much of that are you doing in your life? Is it balanced? Is it all about worldly things? Or do you have your time when you're like a little bit of worldly stuff, but for the most part, I'm going down my Dharma street? How does it feel? And you check your own mind. How does it feel in each of these things? How does it feel like that? Because I noticed there was something I was doing. I can't remember where I was with a group of people. And oh, I remember now. There's some people, recently I was with this group of people for about 3 days, just a family thing that went on. And by the end of the 3 days, I was really like, it's been wonderful to see you, but I really needed a break. I was really like swallowed up in this thing, so just try to strike a balance and really think about what is the place of virtue in your life. How much are you practicing? What are you setting yourself up for happiness in the future? Are you going to make sure that red carpet, in a sense, is laid out for your spiritual path, that it's going to be a nice, beautiful, rich experience that is going to lead you to more and more and more happiness? Does that make sense? And and be honest, how's it going? So I want to just stop there for a moment and just check, can we just turn the text off for a moment, Sunny? And I want to ask if there's any questions about anything that I've been talking about, saying things like that. Please. Duncan, please. And let me find where Duncan is. There you are. And just unmute. Thank you.
Yes, so I had a question really about how the word suffering is being defined in his text. And how, I've heard this aphorism that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And the implication is that pain is going to happen to us, various kinds. But our reaction to pain can involve suffering, sense of dissatisfaction, and that's all optional. But I'm not sure that that's how he's using the word. He sometimes implies that he's using the word that way, but then on the top of page 2, he says, if you do not feel anxious, your strength of mind can help you bear even great sufferings easily. They feel light and flimsy like cotton, but because of anxiety, you are ceaselessly oppressed by unhappy feelings. So there he seems to be using the word suffering to imply external events that are happening to you, i.e. pain. So I'm a bit confused about how he's using the word suffering in this, whether it's
And
external events or whether it's an internal reaction to external.
I think it can be both from what I've heard from different teachings on this. And the other thing is I've also heard the words interchangeable, where some people will say, pain is going to happen, but the suffering is optional. So I've heard those interchangeable, where some people will use the word and say suffering's inevitable, but the pain is optional. But some people say the pain will come, but the suffering's optional. So I think it's mental and physical, like it's external, internal, because some people have tremendous internal suffering as well. So either way, I think it's when it does turn up, what are you doing with it? How are you dealing with it? That's my understanding of it. Does that help? Sorry, sorry, you were muted.
Sorry. I guess if you think about the metaphor of the 2 arrows, which I find very useful, there's an implication. The arrow comes into you, and that's the pain, and it's a clear pain. And then your reaction to this is your second arrow that comes in. That seems to be a good distinction to keep in mind. But that's my personal view. So I'll leave it there.
Yes, but I think when you just said what kind of suffering, I think there's when you said, is it external? We also have internal suffering. I mean, the mind can really do it. So again, if that shows up, I mean, there's people that are contacting me with tremendous anxiety and depression now. So it may be a result, we could say, of external circumstances around them, but some of them have a habit of anxiety and depression regardless of whether life is easier, regardless of whether they feel the externals are more peaceful, and it's a habit. So again, that's a form of suffering. When you were asking, what does he mean by, what does he mean by suffering? So I think regardless of those things that happen, internal or external, how do we deal with it? So, because there are people, that have some internal imbalances, but then they manage to balance it a bit better. And they have the habit of managing it better. Would you agree? Versus some that don't, some that just fall right, because again, if you go on through some of those letters that we just read, they don't have as much virtue developed, let's say, or they're not reaching for refuge as much, or they're not seeing it as a type of purification. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I would say, Duncan. Yeah, and it is a good one to think about the 2 arrows, and to think about, I often think about that because we do all know people that choose suffering again and again, right? And not in the good way that he's talking about. They're like, whatever their response is to it, they're always negative. And then we do know people and I know people in tremendous pain, and some of them are some of the most cheerful, helpful people I know. Like that. So it is good to think about what is my response to it when it shows up like that. Meredith.
Hello, thank you so much for this. It's a real pleasure it's the first time I've ever sat with you, and it's been just a true gift. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I just wanted to
Joining.
ask
Yep.
about spiritual harm, in that I'm very, very fortunate to have wonderful, genuine teachers. But I'm just aware, I think, with the rise in secularism and not least the sort of slings and arrows of modern life. There's a lot of false teachers around, and particularly social media amplifying, almost becoming a factory line to some really, really awful, quite false views, and some kind of self-aggrandizing folks. I'm just wondering how one can purify or transform the adversity that is perhaps falling into the wrong crowd of and receiving real spiritual harm, which might then misdirect them from the path for maybe a lifetime or more. How in that context where you then have no your compass back to path is obscured in a way, it's almost like a doubt in itself. How can you take and transform that adversity, or even as a bystander, maybe help a person in that circumstance?
Sure. And certainly a big one these days of, I think partly in general, looking at when we go off course in the wrong way in general. I mean, it happens to us. Like sometimes people choose the wrong job and they kind of thought it was going to be a toxic environment, and it is. They had signs, but they kind of said, well, I liked where it was located. So it's similar with spiritual teachers and different guides and things. And so the main thing is, can we be careful overall to try to advise somebody if they're looking at a center, or they ask you and they go, what about this? Or I met somebody and this is my path and this is what I'm doing. And so I would just, calmly, like a lot of people ask me about teachers and did you see this and look at this link, and sometimes I'm always checking. A long time ago, I worked for a magazine called Mother Jones Magazine in San Francisco. And so I learned very much at that time I always ask people now, where did you get the information from? That was all, what's the source of that story? People tell you news stories or tell you this happened. And so it's similar with spiritual guides of His Holiness says, spend 6 years and be a spy on your guru before you accept them as a teacher. Don't just jump because everyone else is doing it. So I would just try to calmly advise somebody and just say, make sure you check them out thoroughly. This is a serious relationship. And if you do have some flags, like alarms going off, I would check that out a little bit, try to get the information that you can, and make sure, if you can, to try to go in person to see a teacher at some point. There's a different feeling in their presence versus watching a video, watching a recorded video that already took place. And it's good to get a nice sense of them from a video that you can watch, but then if it's possible, make the effort. Sometimes you may have to travel a distance, but see if you can get in person if you really think they're special and everything you've checked out is working well like that. So I do know it's not perfect, but our FPMT teachers list, we try to vet people. We try to check as far as the Tibetan teachers. Nobody's perfect, but it's a pretty good list for starters, and we have to sign ethical agreements and things like, so there are organizations that may not do that and things like that. So I think we do the best we can, right? And again, if your karma takes you down a negative street where there's harm and there's, like I said, many organizations, spiritual organizations, have had teachers that have done some questionable things, whether it's sexual harassment, sexual abuse, that certainly happened in many organizations. And so again, in a sense, it's your karma if you get involved in that and it happened to you. But we can always heal. We can always find our way back, and make sure you take the time for the healing and take the time for counseling and discussing and making sure the organization is taking some responsibility to make amends. And again, degenerate times, these are some of the signs of that this is considered a degenerate time according to Buddhism, where some systems are sort of breaking down. And this is something that we've been taught for years, that, so these are some of the signs of whether it's global warming or whether the general feeling of the mind in the world is not as healthy as like that. So, but we're also looking at a broader range of time Like some people complain to me, they go, oh, the wars and all that. I'm like, there have been wars on this planet for centuries that were really violent, like that. So this isn't a new thing to our world system, but it's an unfortunate thing. And maybe we can set up a situation where we go to a place where there isn't war and violence and hostility, where hatred is minimized. And in a sense, if you go to what's considered a Buddhist pure realm, it's not a God realm, but a pure realm is places where you've set up a situation for yourself where you have every perfect condition to practice Dharma. That's a pure realm. Every situation set up. You don't need to go shopping for food because when you need food, the food's just provided. That's what a pure realm is like. Every perfect Dharma retreat setting is set up for you. So the way it's been described to me, pure realms, and they exist somewhere, but very high level practitioners, and the people there are very close to enlightenment. We could set that self up for ourselves like that. It is possible. It is possible. Right. But we limit ourselves where, we maybe are not practicing enough to even conceive that we can get to a place like that. But I really believe it's possible. And then what happens is sometimes you have small pockets of that you create in your life. For instance, you could go to Vajrapani Institute in California, one of our beautiful retreat centers. You could go to Milarepa Center in Vermont, if you're on the East Coast of the States. There's other centers, but those are just a couple in our lineage that I'm thinking of. And there's many others around the world like that. And you could set up your own little weekend retreat, or maybe you go there for a week. Maybe you join a group retreat for a month, and in that sense, you end up creating your own little pure realm. That's how, I got my few months at Laudo this summer, and the few people that are there, they couldn't do enough to support my retreat. It's very, very pure air, very, very pure water. Just every condition is there. There's meditators in the region around there. So you have this blessing and we can set ourselves up for little snippets of that, basically. It depends on your priorities, right? Like that. So I believe it's really possible, and that for me, I'm at the point in my life where I want to make time. I must make time every year to at least get my mind into one of those settings. I mean, whether I'm even here in the house, I've done retreat in this house. That's okay. I could do it here, and you just make that time for some sort of quiet, contemplative space, because that's a way to build virtue in your mind if you're doing it in a good way. Not wasting the time, but really putting that effort in. It's hard work. It's some of the hardest work I've done, and some of the most rewarding, like that will keep me away from future lives where I make the wrong choices as far as a guide and as far as the wrong organization and things like that. If that makes sense, Meredith, like that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, why don't we stop there? And we're going to pick up the text next week. I want you to please spend the week. Think about what we've read through so far this week. When suffering is going to come. It's going to be there, small or big. I hope it's small for you. But if it comes a little bit bigger, you have a few tools to look at it, analyze it. Again, use it to build renunciation. Think about, do I really have strong refuge when it comes? Am I kind of folding in on myself and cursing at everybody and yelling at everybody and hostile and, can I see it as a way of purification? There's so many ways you can make it more useful. So I'd love to hear any little transformative stories next week, like that. So I hope that's been helpful. It's lovely seeing everyone. So please try to use some of those. Look at the text again, read through the text, and then we'll continue on next week. And possibly if some of you are in the New York area, February 18th, in 2 weeks, I will be at the center in person, and it would be wonderful to be there with some of you. And Sheila, do let me know what can we get together. We were going to get together maybe before that. afternoon. If there's some people around, maybe we can get together with some of you. It would be wonderful, like that. And then the rest of us will be online as well. So we'll continue on. Thank you. So can we do some dedication prayers? Thank you. Wonderful. So what I'd like to do is, because it's such a profound task, whatever merit, let's think about whatever merit, whatever positive energy we've created from spending this time. And one of the best things, so that we don't destroy whatever positive energy that we've just created, we dedicate the merit, we invest it, we kind of seal it in. And these prayers are helpful. You can always do a lot more prayers like that. And we have Rinpoche's return prayer as well that we can do after. And if not, I can share, but we're going to read them in English, and we're going to chant them also in the phonetics. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. So let's just do the chant so we get used to these chants of these two quite popular, famous dedication prayers. Gewadi nyordu dag lama sangye drug your name drawa chi kyang malupa Dei sala uparjok Changju Senju Rinpoche Mage Panam Ge Gyurchik Ge Panyam Pa Me Bayong Gone Gondu Bel Warjok. And the long life prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And the swift return prayer. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Lojong father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings, through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make requests. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings you suddenly departed to peace, what a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week.
Thank you, Venerable.